Hi, what the frack just happened in Mali? I'm referring to the events of this past weekend, 25 April 2026. Today happens to be 29 April 2026. On 25 April, Saturday, there was this wave of terrorist attacks and rebel attacks, and Al Qaeda was in the mix, and the Russians were there, and all sorts of terrible things happened. There was a truck bomb that killed the Minister of Defense. It's crazy. So what's going on? In this video, I'm going to explain it. I'm going to explain 25 April, and I'm going to also try to provide enough contextual information and background information about Mali to help you really better place the events of 25 April and the significance and consequences. So I will talk about April 25. But this is also going to be a lot of background about Mali in this video, sort of like a Mali 101, everything you need to know about Mali. Not everything there is to know about Mali, everything there is to know in general. I could make a 10-hour video very easily about Mali, but you don't want to see that, and I don't want to edit a 10-hour video, so I'm going to try to keep this as briefly as possible. But I want to try to stick to the things that I think you need to know to understand everything. My name is Michael Shirkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. If you like this, as usual, hit like and subscribe. Think about hitting the thanks button or even becoming a member of the channel, or you could buy me a coffee using the link in the description below. And never forget to check out my merch. Now, as you may know, my day job is I'm the director of global programs at a business intelligence firm called 14 North Strategies. And what we do is we advise businesses that do business in Africa about political and security risk and that kind of thing. So I've been spending, believe me, the last few days writing a lot about Mali for various clients. Now, I track this as my job. Also, I've been working on Mali for the last 25 years, reading about it, writing about it, publishing it. I've written a lot about it. I put all the links in the description so that you can peruse. I do read, even the stuff that's out of date is still extremely useful for background information. Although after this video, some of it will be familiar to you. I've been to Mali a bunch of times. I've worked on the Malian military. I've worked with the Malian military for a brief period of time. I was embedded in Mali's National Security Council. This was unfortunately before COVID then immediately happened and then kind of killed that program right when it just got started, which was a shame because for me that was like a dream job. Point is, I know a thing or two about Mali, and the challenge is in making a half-hour, an hour-long video. The challenge is in not making this video 10 hours long. So anyways, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to break this presentation down into several points. And of course, I put timestamps in the description so that you can jump around and get to the parts that interest you most. And also to give you road maps and road signs so that you know where we're going in this conversation. Part 1, Mali 101, the basics of geography and demography and ethnography that I think you need to know. Part 2, the North-South split, the politics, the history of northern rebellions. Part 3, Mali's little terrorist problem, which began roughly 2003. And in that section, I'm going to go to 2012. Part 4 is going to focus on the events of 2012. Part 5 is going to talk about the French intervention known as Serval, which began in January 2013, and the subsequent evolution of the situation. Part 6, are we up to 2020? We're going to talk about 2020, the coup and the junta that came in, and then the departure of the French and the entrance of the Russians onto the scene. Next, I want to talk about Mali's strategic errors, which I think is very helpful for understanding why things have gotten as bad as they have since the junta, since the coup. And then finally, I want to talk actually kind of briefly about 25 April, because at this point there's relatively little to say, but we'll address it. And then finally, I'll conclude with the part that gets into my forecast for what's going on. Spoiler alert, I'm not optimistic. So let's get cracking. Part 1, Mali 101. Here's a map of Mali situated in the general region referred to as the Sahel. Now, you need to know a few things here right off the bat. First of all, the Sahel is not a politically defined thing. There are no formal borders. The borders you see on this map and on any map of the Sahel are rough approximations. What defines the Sahel is not politics or any socio-economic reality, but rainfall. It's all about rainfall. The Sahel is a part of Africa that has some rainfall, much more than the Sahara Desert, but less than the bits that, the territory that happens below the Sahel. Yes, the Sahel technically stretches from the Atlantic all the way to the Red Sea, but most of the time when people talk about the Sahel, they're referring to the bit that was incorporated into the French Empire, rather than the British or whatever else, right? So we're talking from the Atlantic to the border between Chad and Sudan. Second thing you need to know is that the Sahel is huge. Even just the French Sahel, the distance between the Atlantic and the border between Chad and Sudan is the same roughly as the distance between Philadelphia and San Francisco. Big, big expanse. Third, Mali itself is huge. The northern half is about the size of Texas, which is about the size of France. So imagine France or Texas, but with only maybe 1 million people, a little over 1 million people, and no highways, very few roads, and almost no infrastructure to speak of. That's northern Mali. Fourth, the borders are radically disconnected from any kind of political or socioeconomic or demographic reality. These borders that you see that divide these countries into countries are drawn by French and British administrators, colonial administrators and military commanders. They have no relation to reality. If anything, they're a reflection of the politics within the French colonial administration or the relationship between Britain and France. A fifth thing to know about the Sahel is that rainfall patterns are really everything. They define who lives where and how they survive and how they organize themselves. And ideally, if you really wanted to draw political boundaries that had some correlation to the on-the-ground realities, you would draw countries that are narrow strips running from east-west. Imagine horizontal Chiles. In fact, Chile is a really apt thing because Chile is as long as the United States is wide, and this is as wide as the United States. So you'd have these horizontal Chiles stacked upon one another instead of these north-south vertical slices that the French powers and the British drew and what they did to carve up the Sahel. This is a case where, because of the rainfall patterns, where Montesquieu was correct. And Montesquieu, remember, writing in the 18th century, he had this whole argument about he reduced political evolution and economic evolution to climate. We should add to that Karl Marx. And so because basically the climate determines the means of production, which determines how the people organize themselves socially and their families and even their marriages and culture, et cetera, et cetera. Everything stems from climate and then means of production. Now, let's take a look at this map of Mali. You see there are basically two halves separated more or less by the Niger River, which sort of runs east and west, although it obviously curves down south through Bamako. Bamako, Timbuktu, and Gao are all on the Niger River. Timbuktu and Gao and everything north is northern Mali. Below it, we have central Mali, and then finally, southern Mali. The body of water that you see to the southwest on this map of Timbuktu, in the narrow bit of Mali between Burkina Faso and Mauritania, that's referred to as the Niger Bend or the Niger Inner Delta. This is what central Mali is. There's plenty of water there because of the Niger River and because of the waterways. There's a lot of water, so there's both farming and herding and lots of fishing. The central Mali is sort of like where north and south intermingle. You know, it's like sweet water and salt water in sort of this intertidal zone. That's central Mali. That makes central Mali a very distinct place with its own realities, its own means of production, its own divisions, et cetera, et cetera. Northern Mali, it's mostly herding, almost entirely herding. Central Mali, it's a combination. Southern Mali, it's much more farming with some herding going on. Let's talk demographics. Mali has about 22.4 million people, according to the 2022 census. Here's the thing, though. The vast majority of Malians live in central and southern Mali, and frankly, most of them live in southern Mali. So according to that census, only about 11 to 12% of the population lives in northern Mali, so Timbuktu and Gao and north. So almost 90% of the population lives south of Timbuktu and Gao, with most of those concentrated in Bamako itself, and what's known as southern Mali. So about 18.9 or 4.2 million in 2022 live in Bamako City, which is a lot of people. 2/3 of Mali lives in southern Mali, about a quarter lives in the central belt, and just 1 out of 10 lives in the far north. This tells you a lot about Mali. This tells you a lot about their dynamics. As for the north, only 1 out of 10 Malian lives up there, but it's 2/3 of Mali's territory. I often joke that that northern Mali has a negative population density. Now we have to talk very briefly about ethnicity. Mali is super, super diverse ethnically and linguistically. Some ethnic groups have their own languages, but some not. There's just a very rich mosaic. The ethnic groups are not divided. It's not like you might see on maps, like the Tuareg are here and the Arabs are here and the Bambar are here or whatever. It doesn't really work that way. There are no boundaries. Everybody's mixed together, particularly in the cities. And certainly in Bamako, you can find everybody together. It's just that in some areas, you have a preponderance of one group versus the other. But they're all intermingled to some extent. It's just a question of the composition and the ratios, the proportions, relative proportions of the different ethnic groups in any given place is going to vary considerably. Southern Malians, where most people live, these are ethnic. I think they're often referred to as Mande or Malinke. They are Bambara speakers, mostly. You also find Dogon, and you find Fulani, or in French you call them Poul. They speak their own language. Central Mali is where the Fulani are predominant, and then in northern Mali, you're going to run into now growing numbers of Arabs and Tuareg. The Arabs are clustered more towards Timbuktu and sort of the western half of the north, along the border of Mauritania and Algeria. The Tuareg are more clustered in the eastern half of northern Mali, hard up against the borders of Algeria and Niger, to some extent Burkina Faso. The Arabs come in different subgroups, different communities, different castes and clans. The Tuaregs are also divided amongst themselves. The Tuaregs in Mali are divided into, I think it's 3 basic tribal confederations, and each tribal confederation has like dozens of tribes and sub-tribes, and these sub-tribes are divided into castes, because there's this whole caste system with noble castes and commoner castes and former slave castes and blacksmith castes, and everybody has a place in some sort of social political hierarchy. There's a pecking order that I'm going to talk about a little bit more. The Arabs and Tuareg together are really Berber. So the Arabs aren't Arabs, they're Berber, but the difference between the Malian Arabs and Tuareg is that the Arabs speak an Arabic dialect, and they self-identify as Arabs, and they often sort of tie their family genealogies to the Arab invasions of the Maghreb, whereas the Tuareg speak a Berber language known as Tamashek. So genetically, they're cousins, but culturally, they're much more distinct. Part 2, North-South politics. Northern and Southern Mali are stuck together because that's how the French wanted it. The French drew the boundaries. Other than that, the Northerners and Southerners inhabit different universes, different cultural universes. And to the extent that they've ever interacted, often it's in bad terms, negative terms. The Northerners would be slave raiders. They would raid the South for slaves. They're warriors, they're traders, they're slavers, the Southern Malians. It's just different. So the extent that they would ever rub shoulders, there was friction. They don't like each other. It's just different. They're very different. What the French did, so the French mushed them all together in one larger administrative area, but what the French did also was that they established or sometimes created hierarchies with a pecking order, with some people on top and some people at the bottom. There's this whole hierarchy and structure, this whole like pecking order of all the different groups. The French created this, froze it into place, or they either created it or something they simply froze in place what they found on the ground. And they maintained that hierarchy. And that's the Pax Gallica that lasted from roughly the French invasion late 19th century up until 1960 when the French left. When the French walked away, they handed the keys over to some of the Southerners, which came as a shock to many of the Northerners. Like, what the hell, right? First of all, we want autonomy, and we asked Charles de Gaulle for autonomy, but also like them, you're putting those guys in charge. They're racist. Southerners are racist against the Northerners. Northerners are racist against the Southerners. They're equally racist against one another. I really, really hate to say it. Which doesn't mean that often they don't get along very well and they're friends and intermarry and whatever. I don't want to polarize things too much, but there's a lot of, I don't know, incomprehension between the two. Anyways, the Northerners did not appreciate being put under the control of a government run by the Southerners. Also, I think more importantly, the removal of France removed the force that kept the social hierarchies that define the Pax Gallica in place. The French leave, and the whole hierarchy, the whole political dispensation starts to unravel. And all the different subordinate groups within the pecking order and above the pecking order, like within the Tuareg confederations and the Tuareg confederation vis-a-vis the other Tuareg confederations or vis-a-vis the other ethnic groups, everybody started sort of jockeying for position. If you're lower down the pecking order, you want to raise yourself elevate yourself in the interest of yourself and your community. If you're higher up the pecking order, you want to defend your own prerogatives against these sort of up-and-coming people who are challenging your prerogatives in your place. All of it in a zero-sum game for power and access to resources. This is really in northern Mali, the top dogs of the hierarchy that the French put in place was one specific Tuareg tribal confederation known as the Kel Adagh. Their epicenter is Kidal. France allied with them in 1960 in order to break the back of a larger tribal confederation that rebelled. So they formed a military pact with the Kel Adagh, and then once that insurrection was over, the military pact continued, and basically the deal was like, you guys are in charge, but in exchange, you're going to help us, France, defend Mali's border against raiders from Morocco, and the Kel Adagh were like, fabulous. So this made the French, the Kel Adagh, the top dogs, and then within the Kel Adagh, the top clans, top tribes are also affirmed by France as the heads of the Kel Adagh. So it's this whole political structure. So this is why in 1960, 61, 62, when Mali took over northern Mali, this sort of black African southern Malian government and military showed up in northern Mali in places like Kidal. This really kind of threatened everybody. I don't think anybody really appreciated this in northern Mali, but the people who really had the most to lose were the Kel Adagh, particularly the elite clans and tribes within the Kel Adagh, because they had been the top dogs of the French colonial system. And now they're at risk. And now all these upstart subaltern groups are trying to jockey their way ahead, both within the tribal confederation and among the tribal confederation and everybody else. Plus, the first Malian president, Modibo Keïta, he put into place policies that were inimical to the interests of Tuaregs and the Kel Adagh. So in 1963, I believe, some elements of the Kel Adagh rebelled. Now, we need to be super careful here. When we talk about Tuareg rebelling, it's never the Tuareg. When we talk about Arabs rebelling, it's never the Arabs. It's not the anything. It's always a fraction of a fraction, fraction being this wonderful French colonial term when they would describe these things. The Tuareg are a faction, the Kel Adagh are a faction of the Tuareg faction, and within the Kel Adagh there are factions of factions. Ditto for the Arabs, ditto for everybody. It's never all, it's never the in bulk as a monolithic entity. It's always just some. The vast majority of Tuaregs, by and large, had nothing to do with any of these rebellions. Just the vast majority of Tuaregs have nothing to do with the rebel movements or the jihadist movements. We talk about the Fulani in terms of the Fulani being associated with the jihadism. I'm very certain that the vast majority of Fulani have nothing to do and want nothing to do with jihadism. Anyway, in 1963, a fraction of the Kel Adagh rebelled, and the Malian government put them down savagely. It was a brutal, brutal war. The Malian military in those days had a real military advantage over the Tuareg. One of the reasons for this is because the Malian military, such that it was in 1963, basically consisted of veterans of the French army. Many of whom I believe had actually seen combat in Algeria and in Indochina, so they knew what they were doing. I would argue that the Malian army qualitatively declined after that point for various reasons, while the Tuareg and the Arabs in the north were able to make better use of their inherent qualitative advantages over the Malian military. There thus was peace, although it was bitter because there's lots of acrimony because of all the blood spilled in 63. This lasted until 1990, 1991, when there was another insurrection led by Tuaregs, again by certain elements within the Kel Adagh tribal confederation, though there's some other Tuareg groups joined in, and also some Arab groups joined in. Each had its own rebel movement, and this time they were stronger relative to the Malian government, so they did better, and the war lasted up until 1996. At the same time, Mali itself was going through its own upheaval. There was a coup which led to an actual democratic transition to civilian government. So Mali was going through this democratic transition, wonderful stuff, while having to cope with this Tuareg and Arab insurrection. It all worked out, though. 1996, there's this peace accommodation, a peace accord, everything was fine. Mali seemed to have a bright future, and at that point, everybody started saying everything's great in Mali. Mali is this sort of model case of a country that works. So this is awesome. One bad thing, though, the war did leave a lot of acrimony, in part because a lot of civilians were killed, and also the Malian government showed that it had a habit of resorting to using local militia to do their dirty work. Specifically in the 1990s, the Malian government promoted, it sponsored a Songhai militia called Gonda Koy that is responsible for a lot of the worst atrocities of the war. And people don't really forget that, and this is also something that the Malians kind of keep doing, using these militias in part as a reflection of their own structural weakness. Like if your army's too weak to do the job, you go and you enlist a bunch of auxiliaries. There were a few small rebellions in the early 2000s, like 2006, 2009 timeframe. Again, most of the work of certain subsections of the Kel Adagh for various reasons and Arab groups. Then came the big rebellion of 2012. Let's put a pin on that. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to talk about the jihadist problem, and then we're going to sort of rejoin the thread of the rebellions in 2012. Malian Islam is super diverse, and it's a very complex subject, so I am grossly oversimplifying here, but basically Malian Islam is itself diverse and generally tracks with sort of your classic West African Sufi kind of humanist Islam. These are not, lunatics running around cutting people's throats. There have historically and still are today within Malian Islam what often are referred to as reformist movements that might be called Islamist. But here we have to stress the difference between Islamists and jihadists. All jihadists are Islamists, but not all Islamists are jihadists. Many of these Islamists are quietists, the term being that they are interested in reforming society and reforming individuals and themselves in the name of piety. They want to Islamicize society, but they're not about to set off car bombs and kill people. That's not what they're all about. They are peaceful, they are benign. It doesn't necessarily mean I want to live under their administration, but at least I know, it's not Al-Qaeda. That's the really important thing. And Wahhabism and Salafism, by and large, did not have a place in Malian Islam. But then in the late 1990s, there was a Pakistani-based movement, a quietist Islamist movement known as the Tablighi Jamaat, sometimes referred to as the Dawa. They showed up and they began proselytizing. A number of elite northern Malians got interested and really got a taste for, those are the first taste for Islamism. So that kind of primes the pump, if you will. And in 2003, the GSPC shows up. What's the GSPC? The GSPC, it's a French acronym for the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat, sort of a vestige of the Algerian Civil War of the 1990s. They turn up in northern Mali and they use northern Mali as a safe haven. They are Algerians interested in fighting the Algerian state, which means that they don't want to mess with Mali. They don't want to cause problems with Mali. They don't want to pick a fight with the Malian government. The Malian government is happy with this. We don't mess with you. You don't mess with us. Everything's fine. Now, something happened, though. Lots of things happened. The GSPC began to take root in Mali. They began to make connections. They intermarried. They got involved in business. They did a lot of things. I mean, mostly what they're doing is trafficking in order to make money to fund their jihad against the Algerian state. But over time, it kind of naturalized, became more and more Malian and less an Algerian thing. And then I think in the 2006 timeframe, GSPC declares its affiliation with allegiance to Al-Qaeda. And in 2007, GSPC rebrands itself as Al-Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM. This becomes a whole different beast. Now this is not a bunch of Algerians camped out in the Malian desert where they're working to fight the Algerian state. Now this is much more a Malian or regional movement interested in a regional jihad. So it's no longer about Algeria. And at some point around this time, they began to kill Malian officials. So the tacit, or maybe not so tacit, non-aggression pact with them and the Malian government ended up falling apart. Now this brings us to part 4, 2012. January 2012, Tuareg Rebellion happens. It's a predominantly Kel Adagh Tuareg with some other Tuareg join in, and some of the Arab groups jump in, and some other groups as well, some Songrai, some this and that. It's very diverse, but it's really predominantly Tuareg, predominantly Kel Adagh Tuareg. They rise up and they defeat northern Malian garrisons, most notably in January 24, 2012, the MNLA, that's what it's called, the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad referring to northern Mali. The MNLA seizes Al-Gahok, northern Mali, and they massacre the 90 to 100 Malian soldiers who had already surrendered. So they executed the prisoners. The collapse of the Malian military, the massacre at Al-Gahok, this really demoralized the Malians, which made everything worse. And it also encouraged a Malian captain to mutiny in March of 2012 and to depose the constitutionally and democratically elected president of Mali. Now, the MNLA kicked off the rebellion, but very soon after, AQIM and some other jihadist groups that emerged, came out of the woodwork at about the same time, like roughly end of 2011, January 2012, They joined together, they joined the MNLA, they helped the MNLA, they kind of drafted off the MNLA the way like a race car can draft off a car that it's following to make it easier. And then it's MNLA betrayed them, and hijacked the rebellion and kicked the MNLA out of the country. And they assumed control over all the bits that the MNLA had controlled, such that by June 2012, the jihadists control now basically all of northern Mali. And there's kind of like a funny war, trop de guerre, between the Malian state and the jihadists, with the two lines, the line of demarcation running through central Mali. Then we get to part 5, which is Operation Serval, subtitle Deus Ex Machina. January 2013, the Islamists, jihadists, I should say, heed my own advice, the jihadists made a run to the southwest and appeared to be threatening Bamako. The government of Mali called France for help. France responded. To everybody's surprise, and within 24 hours, the French troops were on the ground, and they stopped the jihadist advance, and then they rolled up the jihadist advances, and they ended up basically rolling up northern Mali, handing northern Mali town by town over to nominal Malian government control. I wrote a study of Serval at the RAND Corporation. I put a link to that study in the description. Serval was really fabulous. The French military really showed itself, as being excellent. They were great. So much so that General McMaster, if I recall correctly, who I think at the time was the commander of TRADOC, General McMaster sent an email to his command saying, hey, you got to read this RAND study. The French army really knows what it's doing. This is what it means to be an expeditionary army. And at the time, the U.S. military was all about trying to be expeditionary. Speaking of the French military, time for a shameless promotion. I do recommend that if you're interested in anything about French military strategy and how the French think about conflicts like this or conflicts like anything, I wrote a short book that is for sale on Amazon. It is small, but purposefully short, because this is a distillation of years and years and years of work that I have done reading and studying modern 20th and 21st century French military strategy. And I think the result is a framework for thinking about conflict and thinking about strategy today that I find useful if I want to think about Gaza or Ukraine or Iran or Mali or anything else. So it's short, sweet, to the point. It's a distillation. This is a Johnny Walker Blue Label versus like a 5-gallon jug of Jack Daniels or something like that. Check it out. Link in the description. It's a really great book. So back to Mali. The French smashed apart the jihadist groups, but they didn't really destroy them all. They drove them out, although many survived, many just went to ground, or they slipped across the border into Algeria or Mauritania or Burkina Faso or Niger. Then, bit by bit, they reconstituted themselves and they started causing problems again. In addition, there's a new group that shows up. This is a predominantly Fulani group based in central Mali. This is a very big deal for Mali because central Mali, first of all, there are a lot of Fulani. Central Mali, more importantly, is far more important than northern Mali. In a sense, maybe southern Malians don't want to hear it, but whatever happens in northern Mali doesn't really matter. It's really far away. They don't really even trade with each other. If you live in northern Mali, you're more likely to trade with Algeria than you are with southern Mali because of the road networks. Central Mali is a different story. Central Mali is important. There are actually people who live there. There's economic activity. It's part of what the French, I guess, used to call like le Mali utile, the useful Mali, but also central Mali borders southern Mali. There's no real hard and fast border, so everybody's intermingled. If you lose central Mali to jihadists, that can be fatal, as opposed to losing northern Mali jihadists, which can be irrelevant, kind of like a tree falling in the middle of the woods. Is there anybody, if there's nobody there to hear, it doesn't even matter. Central Mali really matters, a big deal. So because of the entrance of this Fulani group that at some point was referred to in the press as the Messina Liberation Front, now it's also Katibat Messina, it made the whole thing more dangerous, made the epicenter of jihadism in Mali shift to central Mali. Now, Katibat Messina and AQIM and some other groups that remain joined together in 2017 to form something called JNIM. It's an Arabic acronym. Don't ask me to pronounce it or even what it means. Doesn't matter. JNIM then is this jihadist coalition, and they're the ones who are really at power. Also, at some point in this time, Islamic State shows up in the far east of Mali. It's sandwiched between Niger and Burkina Faso in the areas east of Gao. So you've got JNIM now, and you have Islamic State. Meanwhile, back in 2014, Operation Serval morphed into Operation Barkhane. The difference is that whereas Serval was a classic fire maneuver kind of air-land doctrine war, Barkhane is much more about counterinsurgency. And if you're interested in that subject, French counterinsurgency and Barkhane and how the two fit together, I highly recommend the thing I wrote, a study I wrote about French counterinsurgency doctrine and Barkhane for the Texas National Security Review. Link again in the description. The French military liked this study so much that they translated it and published it about a year later under the aegis of IRSEM, the École Militaires Institute for Strategic Research, I think it is. Again, link in the description. If you read French, I recommend you read the French version rather than the American version. The reason being that the French version, being like a year later, is a little bit more up to date and a little bit more, I edited it a little bit. The war ground on up until 2020, when Mali suffered another coup. A clique of colonels overthrew the democratically elected constitutional president of Mali and took power. They did this for a number of reasons. They're frustrated with the leadership, they're frustrated with the military, they're frustrated with the course of the war, they're frustrated with the French, they're frustrated with the United Nations, they're frustrated with the West in general, and they also wonder, why is it that the French haven't won yet? Mighty French military is supposed to have defeated the jihadists. How come the war is still happening? And they started to suspect that maybe because the French don't want to win, because the French don't want the war to end, because as long as the war is going on, the French have an excuse and justification for being there, for maintaining their military presence in the Sahel, where they presumably can exploit all the natural resources. It's nonsense. But a lot of Malians started thinking along these lines. I mean, how else do you explain the persistence of the war? Now, I can explain it, but it's also hard to understand when you're on the ground and you think, why isn't this war over? Malians even went so far as accusing the French of aiding and abetting the jihadists, supporting the jihadists. There's a little grain of truth here, and the grain of truth has to do with the fact that at various points during all of this, the French flirted with working with the rebels to use them as a proxy against the jihadists. The French distinguished the jihadists and the rebels, the MNLA from the JNIM. They thought these are very different people with different objectives, different aims. We can work with the MNLA, we can't work with JNIM. So maybe we can work with the MNLA, maybe we should do that. And there are a few other groups that they kind of work with a little bit. For French, this distinction between the rebels and the jihadists is important. And the French kept saying all along, Americans as well, don't fight the Northerners, come to some political accommodation with them. This is all peace process they put in place, the Algiers Accords. The UN was there in order to implement the Algiers Accords, work it out with the Northerners, don't fight them, focus on fighting the jihadists. But for Mali, these guys were the jihadists. So what's the difference? It looks like they're supporting the jihadists. Also, the Malians never forgave, Southern Malians never forgave what France did with Kidal. When the French army arrived at the gates of Kidal, 2013, instead of handing over the city to the Malian military that was kind of tagging along, they handed Kidal over to the MNLA, which was now back in the country after having been kicked out by the jihadists. This was inexplicable to the Malians. It was an outrage. It was a betrayal. It was proof that the France was really on the side of the Tuaregs and thus of the jihadists. My understanding of it is that the French did not want to let the Malian army into Kidal because they were afraid that the Malian army would massacre the people of Kidal in revenge for the massacre of Malian soldiers by the MNLA in Agahok in January of 2012. But they didn't explain this, or they didn't explain this sufficiently to the Malians, or maybe the Malians just weren't listening to whatever the French wanted to say about this topic. So we've got this new junta led by Colonel Keïta, who of course then promotes himself general, because why not? And they did a few things. He did a few things. He asked the French to leave, he kicked out the UN, and he invited Russia's Wagner group to take the place of the French. Why did he get rid of the French? Well, as I said, they are frustrated with the French. They are convinced that the French are really on the jihadist side. They didn't really understand the limits of what the French could do. And what I mean by that is, first of all, France sent a brigade, and only a brigade. That's about 5,000 people. In an area the size of Mali, or actually the size of the region, because Barkhane's area of responsibility, its AO, was the entire Francophone Sahel. That's a lot of ground to cover for only 5,000 people. ultimately what you're doing is whack-a-mole. The French didn't send more for lots of reasons, mainly because they didn't want to be devoting their entire military to this fight in Mali. They thought that there are other things that they needed to be able to do, other contingencies, et cetera, et cetera. Also, according to French counterinsurgency doctrine, and I get into this in my Texas National Security Review article, current French counterinsurgency doctrine as of 2013 and 2014, I don't remember which, I should have looked it up, but I'll put a link to that in the description, I believe. It's very clear, French military doctrine now is very clear that in a post-colonial context, if you're intervening in another country, the way France is intervening in Mali, right, or the U.S. and France intervene in Afghanistan, or the U.S. intervene in Vietnam, in a post-colonial context, there's really very little that you can do. You cannot win this war for the host nation. They have to win the war for themselves. Now, the way you're going to do that is by helping them, and you help them by buying them space and time in order for the host nation to do the things that they need to do. And what the doctrine says is that what the host nation ultimately needs to do is to, I think this is a direct quote, reforge the social contract. It is a political effort at least as much as it's a military effort. The host nation has to do that. France can't do that for Mali. Mali has to do that. All the French can do is buy the Malian government time and space in order to do all the hard political things it needs to do in order to put an end to this insurrection. That's the French mindset. And the Malians didn't really see it that way. The Malians are like, hey, why aren't you guys winning? You guys are here, so we shouldn't need to worry. It should have been over by now. And we don't have to do difficult political things because you guys are going to save us. You're going to save our necks like you did in 2012. So why should we do this? Now, why the Russians? Lots of reasons. But there's one reason that I want to point out because I think this is, well, frankly, I think it's disturbing. I spoke to Somalian officers about this before the Russians even showed up. And they'd say things to me like, oh, I wish the Russians were here and not the French. I wish the Russians were our partner. And I asked why. And one of the things that he said was that, well, at least the Russians would take off their gloves. Enlever les gants. Oh. So all the things that I didn't like the Russians for, like, the Russian approach to counterinsurgency is basically to kill everybody and blow everything up. That sounded pretty good to a number of Malians. So that's the appeal. Bring the Russians in. The Russians are going to take off the gloves and they're going to kill a lot of people. And the thinking is that's going to give them a strategic advantage. This brings us to part 7, Mali's strategic errors. First big error was kicking out the French and bringing out in the Russians. Why is this an error, strategically speaking? Well, look, if you're frustrated with how well the French are doing with their brigade, how would you expect a smaller force of Russians to do any better? In fact, the French showed up, but they also showed up with combat jets and precision strike capabilities and all sorts of ISR capabilities. Plus, the French are the recipients of a lot of really good American ISR and a really very good American logistical support. It's not logical to think that the Russians are actually improve upon the performance of the French, unless you really think that taking off the gloves is going to make the critical difference. Another problem with the Russians compared to the French is that the Russians have a penchant for human rights abuses. They both committed them in Mali, and their very presence encouraged the Malians to act on their worst impulses. The French and the EU and all the Europeans and Westerners who had been involved in training the Malians had really been working on, getting the Malians, like cleaning up their act. And it had been working. I think even Human Rights Watch said at some point, oh, the record has really improved. The Russians show up, all that goes out the window, and now it's like, do what you will. That's a problem for lots of reasons, but it's certainly a problem because it's almost certain that the abuses by the Russians and the Malian government of civilians, in particular the Fulani, radicalized a lot of the Fulani and pushed them further into the arms of JNIM. So it really just made everything worse. The second, though, strategic error that Mali made was in taking on the Northerners and picking a fight with them. Here's the situation. After Serval and the UN comes in, the French impose this peace process with the Northerners. Don't fight each other. You should have this DDR process. The armed northern groups are going to give up their weapons or they're going to integrate into the Malian military. You're going to have this negotiated peace. The UN's going to be there to take care of everything, to just facilitate everything. But political solution, political compromise, so that everybody can focus on the jihadists. Malians do not like this. Malians are really, really, really angry. Southern Malians are really angry at the Northerners. They're angry at these northern rebel groups, the MNLA, etc. They really want to fight them. They're itching for a fight. So much so that in 2014, Mali actually made a go at seizing Kidal from the MNLA. They sent a column of Malian army soldiers up there. They were massacred. It was a catastrophe. They were massacred by the MNLA while the French more or less looked on and didn't intervene. Mali can't fight the MNLA. They don't have the ability to project force up in the north. They're too weak. The balance of power is not in their favor, even though they tried in 2014. But they really want to. They're itching for a fight. And as they said about reforming themselves and growing themselves, they know that they can't do it as long as the French are around, as long as the UN is around, because the UN basically is a buffer between them and the rebel groups. So you get rid of the French, you get rid of the UN. Now the path is clear to make war on these dormant rebel groups, which is exactly what they did starting in August of 2023. They went after the MNLA, which at some point became called the FLA, the Azawad Liberation Front. Strategically speaking, this is absolutely bonkers. I mean, sure, November 2023, the Malian military seizes Kidal from the rebels. Great. It's a win, right? It's as much of a win as Moscow was a win for Napoleon Bonaparte. And I mean, it's just crazy. By the way, what I forgot to mention is, whereas they failed in 2014, they do succeed in 2023. But the reason why the Malians succeed is, frankly, well, they're better themselves. They did a bunch of military reforms which help. They have more firepower. Plus, they've got the Russians. The Russians do help in a fight, and the Russian presence gave the Malian military more confidence. So I think that's why they were able to actually get all the way to Kidal in 2023, whereas they had failed catastrophically to do that in 2014. It reminds me of another historical analogy that I like to make, is that this is a lot like Pearl Harbor. Bear with me. At the time of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Imperial Army was already bogged down in China, where they had bitten off more than they could chew. So what do? They do the logical thing, which is that they go and pick a fight with the biggest, baddest power in the Pacific, the United States. They lost World War II the day they attacked the United States. Now, the northern rebels aren't that powerful, right? So that's where the analogy falls apart. They're not the United States exactly in this analogy, but the point of the matter is that the Malians are struggling with fighting JNIM. They are struggling, plus Islamic State is now active. It's at best a strategic stalemate. So it makes no sense to then go start a fight with a third group. So it's like a third front, a third enemy. And this is what they go and do. I think this is a huge strategic blunder. So November 2023, in a way, is like the peak of Malian power, backed by Russia, and then slowly but surely, the northern rebels got themselves back together again. They recoalesced after the blows that they suffered in 2023. And JNIM is still out there. Islamic State is still out there. And slowly but surely, all these enemies started gaining ground. And slowly but surely, the Malians with the Russians started losing ground. And the JNIM started being active in southern Mali. Now there's a presence. In August, I think, of 2025, they even declare a fuel blockade in southern Mali and shut off fuel supplies into the country and around the country, and they cut off Bamako, which brings us to part 8, the events of 25 April. Early in the morning of 25 April, elements of JNIM, together with the FLA, the rebel movement, they attacked targets all across the country, from Kidal all the way to Bamako, and including Kati being in the outskirts of Bamako, which is sort of the seat of the Malian military. It's like, so they really went into the dragon's lair. They assassinated the Minister of Defense with a car bomb, which also means that they had really good intelligence about the whereabouts of the Minister of Defense, because it's not like he was in his office at the time. It was really bad stuff. And now there's even a rumor that, a member of JNIM gave an address where he said that they are now going to lay a siege on Bamako. So Bamako, as of this morning, or late last night, is now under siege by JNIM. The fact that JNIM and the FLA are working together is itself also very, very bad news. In the past, these two groups, the JNIM and the Northern Rebels, while there's lots of overlap, generally speaking, weren't after the same things. They had different objectives. They didn't always get along. Sometimes they fought one another. And mostly, to the extent that there's any kind of coordination, it was more in like deconfliction. They did just try not to step on each other's toes. As long as JNIM, FLA, and the Islamic State were working separately and fighting the Malian military separately, this kind of gave the Malians an edge. Once any of the three come together and fight the Malian military together, this puts the Malian military, obviously, in a very difficult spot. And that's exactly what happened on 25 April. This finally brings us to part 9. Forecast. What's going to happen next? Look, as my kids would say, Mali's cooked. I'm very pessimistic about Mali. They're losing. They're losing the war. Everything now is in the hands of JNIM and, to a lesser extent, the FLA. They have the initiative. And by the way, if you read my book, you can learn all about how important that is, strategically speaking, to have the initiative. It's an imperative. They have the initiative, which means that What matters now is what they intend to do. What are they going to do with their initiative? Now, there's an open debate here about JNIM's intentions. What exactly do they want to achieve in Mali? They want to impose Sharia law. That they're clear about. But what else? Do they want to seize Bamako? Do they want to hold Bamako? Do they want to make themselves president of the Republic of Mali? Or do they want to completely topple the entire state? Or do they want to coexist with the state in some way, some form? Will there be some weird cohabitation? Nobody really knows. And that's really the big uncertainty here. It doesn't look good for the Malian state and the Malian Republic. They're losing the war. But how bad it might be depends ultimately on what JNIM hopes to achieve with all this. We don't know. What we can say, though, is that the stronger JNIM becomes in Mali, the greater the peril in all the countries, for all the countries in which JNIM now operates. What countries are those? Benin, Niger, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Ghana, Togo. What am I missing out here? That might be it. Plus, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Guinea are in peril. These are like frontline countries. There's some JNIM elements in Senegal. There's some in Guinea. I don't know if there's any in Cote d'Ivoire. So this is very bad news for the region. The uncertainty here has more to do with the intentions of JNIM, with them having the ability to follow through on whatever it is they want to do at this point. I do not think that the Malian army can stop them. The Malian army might be able to reach a compromise with JNIM, but only if JNIM is interested in a compromise. And we don't really know. I really hope you found this video useful and interesting. I apologize for the length. It's very difficult to squeeze this into a short video. I'd want to do it in 30 minutes, but obviously I failed. If you look in the description, in addition to links to all the publications I've done about Mali, plus my book, don't forget my book, you will find links to my Substack, my LinkedIn, my website, michaelsherkin.com, my Blue Sky, and what else? I think that's about it. Stay tuned. There's plenty more in the pipeline. See you in the next video. Bye-bye. Thank you.